From a man who wrote a book on drinking games for long car rides, one swig of beer for every red VW you see, this is the Daniel Natal Show. In the first video I made, entitled Kicking Away the Ladder Part 1, I spoke about how the powerful often kick away the ladder that they use to obtain success, so that no one coming after them can replicate them. I started off by talking about how powerful nations kick away the ladder from smaller countries to ensure that they remain poor. In this installment, I'm concentrating on another technique that they use, encouraging you not to have a stable nuclear family, while they do. I'll start this installment with French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville. Having lived through the French Revolution's reign of terror, de Tocqueville documented the fight between equality and freedom that was then taking place, with revolutionaries and radicals calling for top-down social solutions in the name of equality, even where equality meant stripping people of their liberty. De Tocqueville wrote, "There exists also in the human heart a depraved taste for equality, which impels the weak to attempt to lower the powerful to their own level, and reduces men to prefer equality and slavery to inequality with freedom." This unhinged desire to collapse everything to a common level of mediocrity was on display from sociology professor Jesse Daniels, who expressed the opinion that families were evidently bad things to have, and that to end income disparities and ban inequality, families, and white families in particular, should be banished. She tweeted out, "I mean, if you're a white person who says they're engaged in dismantling white supremacy, but you're forming a white family plus reproducing white children that you want the best for, how is that helping and not part of the problem?" The good professor's prescription for ending inequality was not inculcating the values in others which made her own class prosperous. Rather, she seemed to want a common leveling, even if it means pulling down groups whose habits and customs were leading to general well-being and prosperity. We see the same thing in this Haaretz op-ed, entitled, "Will the biological advantage of straight people to reproduce be considered a violation of the equality principle?" The article even goes so far as to call the nuclear family a threat. The author of the piece, Carolina Landsman, frames it in terms of social justice, much like her American counterpart, Professor Daniels, who seemed to be making the pitch for discouraging intact families for the prosperous segments of society and the advantages that intact families provide, as a gesture of solidarity with the disadvantaged classes, whom she presumably thinks are incapable of marriage or forging stable relationships. This paternalistic attitude is in fact at odds with history. African Americans, for instance, were more likely to have a child in wedlock than white counterparts well into the 1940s. They had very stable family structures. That is, until the help of progressive intellectuals, most notable of which was President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society Initiative. After the raft of policies associated with that administration's War on Poverty campaign were instituted, the results in retrospect were mixed, to say the least. After more than half a century of these programs, inequality is more pronounced now than it was back then. At the same time, the rates of marriage in the black community eroded as single-family houses were institutionally encouraged. One of the chief methods was the cutting of a woman's benefits if there was a man in the home. Solution? No man. As these policies became entrenched, illegitimacy rates in the black community spiked. In 1965, the year the Great Society programs were rolled out-of-wedlock births in the black community were 25%. By 2015, they reached 73%. According to Michael Massey, before the Great Society, 82% of blacks lived in married two-parent households. 40% of blacks were small business owners. The turnabout was so striking that according to African-American economist Walter Williams, marriage rates among African Americans are lower today than they were under slavery, when marriage was illegal for blacks. He wrote, "According to census data from 1890 to 1940, a black child was more likely to grow up with married parents than a white child." Children who grew up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. The Journal for Research on Adolescence concluded, even after controlling for varying levels of household income, kids in father-absent homes are more likely to end up in jail, and kids who never had a father in the house are the most likely to wind up behind bars. In his book, Dream Hoarders, How the American Upper Middle Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, and Why That's a Problem, Richard Reeves cites the modern nuclear family as an institutional advantage to those who prosper in society. The improving economic fortunes of the upper middle class are not only about wages, he writes. Wives have made an impact too in many upper middle class households. Too high salaries pooled. Families ceased to be sites of economic production a long time ago, but they remain effective vehicles for sharing income and costs. The trouble is that class gaps in education, family structure, and stability mean many of these advantages are skewed towards the top. While there has been a general retreat from marriage and an increase in single parenthood, these trends have left the upper middle class largely untouched. Far from abandoning marriage, College-educated Americans are busily rehabilitating the institution for the modern age, turning it into a child-rearing machine for a knowledge economy. Reeves points out that while single-parent households are now at 40% in the bottom 2 quintiles of the economic hierarchy, in the upper middle class, they only account for 9% of households. Isabel Sawhill, from her book, Generation Unbound, Drifting into Sex and Parenthood Without Marriage, remarks, family formation is a new fault line in American class structure. The problem? Reeves defines the upper middle class as composed of journalists, scholars, technocrats, managers, and bureaucrats, the people with the letters after their names. A group who he fails to mention tend to overwhelmingly hold progressive values. Pew Research finds highly educated adults, particularly those who have attended graduate school, are far more likely than those with less education to take predominantly liberal positions across a range of political values. The problem with academics holding up the traditional family to critical reassessment? While promoting alternative lifestyles to their students, university professors and progressive intellectuals tend overwhelmingly to stick to traditional family structures for themselves and their children, such as the author of the book, I Don't, A Contrarian History of Marriage, where Susan Squire makes a moving case for why traditional matrimony and the accompanying family structure is undesirable, the sincerity of which is immediately rendered suspect when one reads the dust jacket and finds she lives in New York with her daughter and husband of 20 years. Long story short, for a class that has a 91% nuclear family rate to tell the rest of us that ditching the nuclear family is awesome is yet another way that they consolidate their power, by kicking away the ladder. Before you is a moral puzzle. If you push this button, something advantageous will happen for you. But be warned, if you do, a pompous elitist who you do not know and who you will never meet will be heckled mercilessly. The choice is yours. Choose wisely.